Karen Thompson had always been the kind of person who lived life on her own terms. At 45, she was a confident, outspoken woman from Dallas, Texas, with a flair for adventure, or at least what she considered adventure. Her friends back home often joked that Karen could turn even the most mundane trip to the grocery store into an epic story. So when she announced that she was finally taking the vacation of a lifetime to London, everyone knew it would be anything but ordinary. The flight over was long, cramped, and exhausting, but Karen didn't care. She stepped off the plane wearing her signature oversized sunglasses, clutching her designer handbag like it was a treasure chest, and already snapping photos of everything in sight. From the moment she landed, Karen treated London as if it were her personal playground. She marveled at Big Ben, giggled like a schoolgirl while riding the tube, and spent hours wandering through Hyde Park, stopping occasionally to take selfies with squirrels or statues. But nothing excited her more than the thought of visiting Buckingham Palace. For weeks leading up to the trip, Karen had obsessed over pictures of the palace online, the grandeur of the building, the history behind its walls, and most importantly, the iconic royal guards captured her imagination. She imagined herself standing beside them, posing for Instagram-worthy photos that would make all her friends jealous. "I'm going to look so classy next to those guys," she told her best friend over video chat just days before leaving. What Karen failed to understand, however, was that these weren't actors hired to entertain tourists. They were real soldiers bound by strict rules and centuries-old traditions. On the morning of her visit to Buckingham Palace, Karen dressed carefully, choosing an outfit she thought screamed sophisticated traveler. She paired a bright floral dress with chunky heels, topped it off with a floppy sun hat, and added enough jewelry to catch the light, no matter which angle she stood at. As she strolled down the mall, the wide avenue leading up to the palace, Karen couldn't help but feel like royalty herself. The golden gates of Buckingham Palace loomed ahead, glinting in the sunlight, and crowds of tourists buzzed around her, snapping photos and whispering excitedly. When Karen finally reached the front of the line, she found herself face to face with one of the famous royal guards. His tall bearskin hat towered above her, and his red uniform seemed impossibly crisp against the cloudy London sky. For a brief moment, Karen was awestruck. Then reality set in. This wasn't some wax figure or costumed performer. This was a human being whose job required him to stand perfectly still and silent, no matter what happened around him. At first, Karen tried to engage him in conversation. "Hi there," she chirped, waving her hand dramatically. "Do you think we can get a picture together? Maybe give me a little smile." When he didn't respond, she leaned closer, tilting her head quizzically. "Hello? Anyone home?" Still nothing. Not even a blink. Frustration bubbled inside her. How dare he ignore her? Didn't he know who she was, or at least how far she traveled to see him? Unbeknownst to Karen, the guard's stoic demeanor wasn't rudeness. It was part of his duty. These men trained rigorously to maintain their composure under any circumstances, whether facing rowdy tourists or actual threats. But Karen didn't know that. All she saw was someone refusing to acknowledge her existence, and in her mind, that simply wasn't acceptable. Little did she realize, her irritation was about to boil over into something much bigger, something that would change her life forever. Years passed, and Karen's life transformed in ways she could never have predicted. The once infamous Pepper Princess had become a respected advocate for responsible tourism, her name now associated with education and cultural awareness rather than scandal. While the memory of that fateful day at Buckingham Palace still lingered, it no longer defined her. Instead, it served as a turning point, a moment that forced her to confront her flaws and grow into a better version of herself. Karen's advocacy work took her to places she never imagined visiting again. She returned to London several times, not as a tourist seeking photo opportunities, but as a speaker invited to share her story at conferences and workshops. During one visit, she even met privately with members of the Queen's Guard, not to apologize again, but to express her gratitude for the lessons their stoicism had inadvertently taught her. To her surprise, they welcomed her warmly, sharing stories of their own experiences dealing with difficult tourists. One guard joked, "You're famous, you know," before adding sincerely, "We're glad you turned things around." Her travels didn't stop there. Karen visited dozens of countries, immersing herself in local cultures and learning firsthand how to be a respectful guest. In Japan, she marveled at the precision of tea ceremonies and the importance of bowing etiquette. In Morocco, she wandered bustling markets, chatting with vendors and sampling street food while respecting their customs. Each trip deepened her understanding of the world and reinforced her belief that travel should be about connection, not conquest. Along the way, she documented her experiences on her blog and social media channels, inspiring thousands of followers to adopt a more mindful approach to exploration. Back home, Karen's efforts earned recognition beyond what she ever dreamed possible. Travel magazines featured her as a changemaker in the industry, highlighting her campaigns promoting ethical tourism. Schools invited her to speak to students about accountability and personal growth, using her story as an example of how mistakes can lead to transformation. Even former critics began acknowledging her sincerity, praising her commitment to making amends and educating others. Despite her success, Karen remained grounded. She often reflected on the journey that brought her here. The embarrassment, the humiliation, the hard-won lessons, and reminded herself how close she had come to letting pride ruin her life. Those reflections kept her humble and motivated, pushing her to continue advocating for positive change. Her favorite mantra became, "It's not where you start, it's where you choose to go." One evening, sitting on her porch with a cup of tea, Karen pulled out an old photo album. Flipping through the pages, she paused at a picture of herself standing near Big Ben, grinning confidently in her oversized sunglasses. She chuckled softly, shaking her head at the irony. Back then, she thought she knew everything. Now she realized how little she truly understood, not just about the world, but about herself. Though Karen couldn't erase the past, she had learned to embrace it. That chaotic day at Buckingham Palace wasn't just a mistake. It was a gift wrapped in pain and discomfort. It taught her humility, patience, and the value of stepping outside her own perspective. Most importantly, it showed her that growth is always possible, no matter how far someone strays from the right path. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Karen closed the album and smiled. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt ready for whatever came next. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of being judged or misunderstood. She had faced her darkest moments, owned her actions, and emerged stronger because of them. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring challenges, Karen knew one thing for certain. She would never stop learning, growing, or striving to make the world just a little bit brighter, one thoughtful traveler at a time. As Karen stood in front of the royal guard, her frustration began to mount. She had traveled thousands of miles, spent a small fortune on this trip, and now here she was, being completely ignored by someone whose sole purpose, in her mind, was to entertain visitors like her. The absurdity of the situation gnawed at her. How could he just stand there, motionless, as if she didn't exist? Wasn't it his job to make tourists feel welcome? Karen wasn't used to being overlooked. Back home, she was the center of attention wherever she went. Her bold personality and sharp wit made her the life of every party. People listened when she spoke, laughed at her jokes, and admired her confidence. But here, in this foreign city, surrounded by strangers, none of that seemed to matter. The guard's silence felt like a personal insult, and Karen couldn't let it slide. She tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me," she called out, waving her hand right in front of his face. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Still, there was no response, not even a twitch. It was as though he were carved from stone. A few nearby tourists noticed the exchange and started whispering among themselves. Some chuckled quietly, while others looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the spectacle unfold. Karen, however, was oblivious to their reactions. All she cared about was getting the guards' attention. Her irritation quickly turned into indignation. Who did this guy think he was? He wasn't royalty. He was just some guy in a fancy hat and uniform. And yet, he acted like he was better than everyone else. Karen's thoughts raced as she tried to come up with a way to break through his stoic facade. Maybe if she said something clever, he'd crack a smile. Or maybe if she poked him, he'd finally acknowledge her presence. Anything to prove that she wasn't invisible. But the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. This wasn't just about taking a picture anymore. It was about respect. Didn't he realize how much effort she'd put into planning this trip? Didn't he care that she'd flown all the way from Texas to see him and his colleagues? To Karen, it felt like a slap in the face, and she wasn't about to let him get away with it. Unbeknownst to Karen, the guard's behavior wasn't arrogance. It was protocol. Every member of the Queen's Guard underwent rigorous training to ensure they remained disciplined and professional at all times. They were taught to ignore distractions, no matter how provocative, and to focus solely on their duties. For them, maintaining composure was a matter of pride and honor. But Karen knew none of this. To her, the guard's refusal to engage felt like deliberate disrespect, and it stung. The crowd around her grew larger as more people stopped to see what was happening. Some snapped photos, while others recorded videos on their phones. Karen barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the guard, who continued to stand perfectly still, his expression unreadable behind his dark sunglasses. The longer he ignored her, the more determined she became to make him react. And then an idea struck her, one so outrageous that it might actually work. Reaching into her purse, Karen pulled out a small canister of pepper spray. She always carried it with her for safety, especially when traveling alone. But now, she saw it as a tool, a way to force the guard to pay attention. Surely, he wouldn't stay silent if he felt the sting of pepper spray in his eyes. It was a risky move, but Karen didn't stop to think about the consequences. All she could focus on was proving a point. With a mix of determination and defiance, Karen stepped closer to the guard. The tension in the air was palpable. Tourists whispered nervously, sensing that something big was about to happen. Even the other guards nearby shifted slightly, their instincts telling them that the situation was escalating. But Karen was too caught up in her own emotions to notice. In her mind, she was fighting for respect, for validation. What she didn't realize was that her next action would not only shock everyone around her, but also set off a chain of events she could never have anticipated. Karen's journey toward redemption wasn't just about apologizing. It was about action. She realized that saying sorry was only the first step. True change required effort, consistency, and a willingness to give back. Determined to turn her mistake into something meaningful, Karen threw herself into advocacy work, focusing on educating others about responsible tourism and cultural sensitivity. It wasn't glamorous or easy, but it gave her life a new sense of purpose. Her first big project was writing a memoir titled *Lessons Learned. From Pepper Spray to Humility*. The book chronicled her infamous trip to London, sparing no detail about her embarrassing misstep at Buckingham Palace. But more importantly, it delved into the lessons she learned afterward, the humbling experience of prison, the importance of respecting traditions, and the value of stepping outside one's own perspective. Karen didn't sugarcoat anything. She admitted how entitled and reckless she had been, holding herself accountable in ways that resonated with readers. The memoir struck a chord with audiences worldwide. Some picked it up out of curiosity, eager to read about the infamous Pepper Princess. Others were drawn to its message of growth and self-reflection. Book clubs debated its themes. Travelers shared their own stories of cultural misunderstandings, and educators began using excerpts in classrooms to teach students about empathy and accountability. For Karen, seeing her story spark meaningful conversations was both surprising and deeply rewarding. But Karen didn't stop there. Inspired by the feedback she received, she launched a blog and social media channels dedicated to promoting respectful travel practices. Her posts ranged from practical tips, like researching local customs before visiting a new country, to heartfelt reflections on the importance of approaching other cultures with humility and gratitude. She interviewed experts, shared personal anecdotes, and even collaborated with former members of the Queen's Guard, who offered insights into their roles and responsibilities. These collaborations helped humanize the guards for her audience, showing them as real people rather than distant figures in red uniforms. Karen also began speaking at schools, community centers, and travel conferences. Standing on stage, microphone in hand, she addressed crowds of curious listeners, many of whom had followed her story closely. At first, she felt nervous, worried they might judge her or dismiss her message because of her past. But as she spoke openly about her mistakes and what she had learned, the room would grow quiet, captivated by her honesty. By the end of each talk, people often lined up to thank her, not for being perfect, but for having the courage to admit when she was wrong. One of her proudest moments came when a major travel company approached her to partner on a campaign promoting ethical tourism. Together, they created videos and guides encouraging travelers to respect local cultures, support small businesses, and leave destinations better than they found them. The campaign gained traction quickly, earning praise from industry leaders and everyday tourists alike. For Karen, it was proof that her efforts were making a difference, not just for herself, but for others too. Of course, not everyone forgave her. Some critics dismissed her transformation as a publicity stunt, accusing her of trying to profit off her infamy. And while those comments stung, Karen refused to let them derail her progress. She reminded herself that change wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Over time, the negative voices grew quieter, drowned out by the support of those who believed in her mission. Looking back, Karen marveled at how far she had come. What started as a humiliating mistake had become a catalyst for growth and connection. She no longer saw herself as the brash, impulsive woman who had sprayed a royal guard. Instead, she viewed herself as someone who had stumbled badly, faced the consequences, and emerged stronger for it. Though the shadow of that day at Buckingham Palace would always linger, Karen embraced it, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder of how much she had learned. Without hesitation, Karen raised the small canister of pepper spray and aimed it directly at the guard's face. Her finger pressed down on the nozzle, releasing a quick burst of the stinging mist. The crowd gasped in unison as the guard staggered back, momentarily breaking his rigid stance. His gloved hands shot up to shield his eyes, and for the first time since Karen had approached him, there was movement. Real, human movement. For a split second, Karen felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She had done it. She had broken through that impenetrable wall of silence and stoicism. But her triumph was short-lived. Within moments, chaos erupted around her. Other guards rushed toward their colleague, forming a protective circle around him, while shouting orders to clear the area. Tourists scrambled backward, phones still recording, as murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Some people looked horrified. Others seemed torn between shock and amusement. Karen froze, suddenly aware of what she had just done. The pepper spray hung limply in her hand as reality began to sink in. This wasn't some prank or harmless act of rebellion. It was an assault on a member of the Queen's Guard, one of the most respected symbols of British tradition. The gravity of her actions hit her like a ton of bricks. What had she been thinking? Had she really believed this would end with nothing more than a laugh or a scolding? But before she could process any further, the situation escalated. A group of police officers appeared almost instantly, pushing through the throng of onlookers. Their faces were stern, their movements deliberate. One officer stepped forward, pointing directly at Karen. "You, stay where you are," he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. Karen's heart raced as she realized she was now the center of attention, not because she wanted to be admired, but because she was in serious trouble. The officer approached her cautiously, his hand resting on the holster of his baton. "Put the pepper spray down," he ordered firmly. Karen complied immediately, dropping the canister onto the ground as if it were burning hot. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from guilt, but from sheer panic. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't thought beyond the moment of retaliation. Now, surrounded by authorities and an audience that seemed equal parts stunned and judgmental, she felt utterly exposed. As the officer cuffed her hands behind her back, Karen tried to explain herself. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "He ignored me. I just wanted him to look at me." But her words fell on deaf ears. The officer ignored her protests, instead reading her rights in a calm but authoritative tone. "You are under arrest for assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The crowd watched silently as Karen was led away, her bright floral dress and floppy hat looking wildly out of place against the somber backdrop of Buckingham Palace. Cameras flashed, capturing every humiliating moment. Someone muttered, "That's going to be all over the news tonight," while another whispered, "Can you believe she actually did that?" Karen kept her head down, too ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. For the first time in her life, she wished she could disappear. In the police car, Karen's mind raced. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? Just moments ago, she had been a confident tourist eager to capture the perfect photo. Now, she was sitting in the backseat of a squad car, her freedom slipping away faster than she could comprehend. As the vehicle pulled away from the palace gates, she caught one last glimpse of the scene. The guard she had sprayed being helped into an ambulance, his fellow soldiers standing tall and resolute despite the commotion. Karen slumped against the seat, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions, shame, fear, and regret. She replayed the incident in her head, wondering how she could have handled it differently. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't undo what had happened. All she could do now was brace herself for whatever came next and hope that somehow, someway, she could make things right. The night passed in a blur for Karen, though she barely slept. The cold, hard bench of the holding cell offered no comfort, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead kept her mind racing. She had never been in trouble with the law before, not even a parking ticket. And now here she was, locked up in a foreign country, facing consequences that felt like they belonged in a movie rather than real life. Every sound outside her cell, the clanging of keys, the muffled voices of officers, the occasional shout from another inmate, sent shivers down her spine. By morning, Karen's confidence had completely evaporated. Gone was the bold, outspoken woman who had strutted into Buckingham Palace just hours earlier. In her place sat a fragile, frightened version of herself, clutching a thin blanket around her shoulders as if it could shield her from the reality of her situation. When an officer finally opened the cell door and told her it was time to go to court, Karen felt a lump rise in her throat. Court. She hadn't even processed the fact that this wasn't just some minor misunderstanding. It was a legal matter, one that could have serious repercussions. At the courthouse, Karen shuffled inside, her head bowed low to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. The room buzzed with activity, lawyers flipping through papers, reporters scribbling notes, and spectators whispering among themselves. Karen recognized a few faces from the crowd at the palace, their expressions now filled with judgment rather than curiosity. Cameras flashed as she took her seat next to a public defender assigned to her case. Her lawyer, a young man with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned over and whispered, "This isn't going to be easy. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard is considered a very serious offense." Karen nodded numbly, unable to speak. When her name was called, she stood awkwardly, her hands trembling as she approached the stand. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp features and an air of authority, peered down at her over a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. Prosecutors laid out the charges against her: assault, public disorder, and contempt of duty. Each accusation landed like a hammer blow, leaving Karen feeling smaller and more ashamed with every word. When it was her turn to speak, Karen tried to explain herself. Her voice wavered as she recounted the events leading up to the incident. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought he was being rude. I didn't know. I didn't understand." But her words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. The judge listened impassively, her expression unchanged. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the verdict came. Karen was sentenced to 6 months in prison and fined heavily, a punishment far beyond anything she had imagined. As the gavel struck the wooden block, signaling the end of the hearing, Karen collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed by despair. She had always prided herself on being independent and self-reliant, but now she felt utterly powerless. For the first time in her life, she realized that her actions had consequences, real, life-altering consequences. As she was escorted back to the police station to begin processing for incarceration, Karen's thoughts spiraled. How would she survive 6 months behind bars? What would her family think when they heard the news? Would anyone ever forgive her for this colossal mistake? The weight of her decisions pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. But perhaps the hardest part was knowing that she only had herself to blame. No one had forced her to pull out that pepper spray. No one had told her to ignore the guard's silence and escalate the situation. It was all her impulsiveness, her pride, her refusal to see things from someone else's perspective. And now, she would have to pay the price. As the police van pulled away from the courthouse, Karen stared out the window, watching London pass by in a blur. The city that had once seemed so full of promise and excitement now felt alien and unforgiving. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. But the image of the guard's shocked expression lingered in her mind. She knew she couldn't undo what she had done. But maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make amends. Stepping out of the prison gates for the first time in months, Karen was hit by a wave of conflicting emotions. The fresh air smelled sweeter than she remembered, and the sight of open skies above her felt like a gift she hadn't realized she'd missed. But as much as she wanted to revel in her newfound freedom, the weight of what awaited her outside loomed large. Her release may have come early, but the consequences of her actions were far from over. Back home in Dallas, Karen's story had exploded into a global spectacle. News outlets had dubbed her Pepper Princess, replaying the viral video of her spraying the royal guard countless times. Social media was ablaze with memes mocking her, hashtags trending worldwide, and strangers weighing in on everything from her fashion choices to her apparent lack of cultural awareness. Friends who once laughed at her jokes now avoided her calls, and neighbors whispered behind closed doors whenever she passed by. Even her favorite coffee shop barista seemed to hesitate before handing her latte across the counter. At first, Karen tried to ignore it all. She stayed indoors, binge-watching TV shows and scrolling through old photo albums, anything to distract herself from the storm raging outside. But avoiding reality only made things worse. Every notification on her phone brought another reminder of how deeply her reputation had been tarnished. Reporters camped outside her house, desperate for an interview. Hate mail piled up in her inbox. And then there were the brands. Companies she'd worked with casually in the past that publicly distanced themselves from her, citing concerns about their image. One morning, unable to take it anymore, Karen sat down at her kitchen table and stared at a blank piece of paper. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, she could explain herself. Not to justify her behavior, but to apologize sincerely and show that she understood the gravity of her mistake. With trembling hands, she began writing. The letter poured out of her, raw and honest. She admitted that she had acted impulsively and disrespectfully, acknowledging the harm she had caused not only to the guard, but also to British traditions and the people who respected them. She expressed remorse for embarrassing her country and vowed to use her experience as a lesson moving forward. By the time she finished, tears streaked her cheeks, but for the first time in months, She felt a flicker of hope. Karen decided to share her apology during a televised interview, a bold move, but one she believed was necessary. Sitting under the bright studio lights, dressed simply in a navy blouse, she faced the cameras with a mix of nerves and determination. As the host introduced her, Karen took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was doing this. When the questions began, she answered honestly, owning up to her mistakes without making excuses. "I was wrong," she said firmly, looking directly into the camera. "I let my ego get the better of me, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I'm sorry for everything." The response was mixed. Some viewers dismissed her apology as insincere or too little, too late. Others, however, appreciated her vulnerability and willingness to admit fault. Letters of support trickled in alongside the criticism, many from travelers who admitted they'd made similar cultural missteps and admired Karen for confronting hers head-on. Slowly but surely, the tide began to shift. While forgiveness wasn't universal, Karen found solace in knowing that she had done everything she could to make amends. In the weeks that followed, Karen threw herself into learning more about respectful travel practices. She read books, attended workshops, and even reached out to experts in cultural diplomacy, eager to educate herself on how to be a better global citizen. It wasn't easy. She still faced judgment wherever she went, but she refused to let shame define her. Instead, she channeled her energy into turning her experience into something positive, determined to ensure that no one else would repeat her mistakes. For Karen, redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about proving that people can change. And though the road ahead wouldn't be smooth, she walked it with a quiet resolve, knowing that every step forward was a chance to rewrite her story, not as the Pepper Princess, but as someone who had learned the hard way and emerged stronger because of it. Karen's first day in prison was a nightmare she would never forget. The heavy metal doors clanged shut behind her as she stepped into a world completely foreign to her. The air smelled stale, tinged with the faint scent of disinfectant, and something else she couldn't quite place, perhaps fear or resignation. Her designer clothes had been replaced with an ill-fitting gray jumpsuit, and her prized accessories were long gone, confiscated along with everything else that made her feel like herself. For someone who prided herself on appearances, this loss of identity hit harder than she expected. Her cellmate, a wiry woman named Tracy with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, wasted no time sizing Karen up. "So, you're the one who sprayed a royal guard," Tracy said, smirking as she leaned against the top bunk. "Bet you didn't think it'd land you here, huh?" Karen didn't respond. She simply sat on the edge of the lower bunk, staring at the floor, too exhausted and overwhelmed to engage. But Tracy wasn't done. "Welcome to the big leagues, sweetheart. Around here, we call you Pepper Princess. Catchy, right?" The nickname spread quickly among the other inmates, earning Karen equal parts mockery and curiosity. During mealtimes, whispers followed her wherever she went. Some women laughed openly at her expense, while others glared at her like she was some kind of entitled outsider who didn't belong. Karen tried to keep her head down, focusing on surviving each day without drawing too much attention. But survival wasn't easy, not when every aspect of life was controlled by rules she didn't understand and people who seemed determined to test her limits. At first, Karen struggled with even the simplest tasks. Making her bed correctly, lining up for meals, and following instructions during work assignments felt impossible. Every mistake earned her harsh words from the guards and snickers from the other prisoners. One morning, after spilling a tray of food in the cafeteria, Karen broke down in tears. A few inmates rolled their eyes, muttering about how soft she was, but one older woman named Margaret quietly handed her a napkin. "You'll get used to it," Margaret said softly. "Just take it one day at a time." Over time, Karen began to adapt, or at least pretend to. She learned to wake up early, fold her clothes neatly, and avoid eye contact with anyone who looked like trouble. She also started paying closer attention to the women around her, realizing that many of them carried burdens far heavier than hers. There was Tracy, whose tough exterior masked years of abuse. Margaret, who spoke fondly of her grandchildren, but rarely received visits, and countless others whose stories reminded Karen that everyone had reasons for ending up where they were. Slowly, she began to see herself not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone who needed to take responsibility for her actions. One evening, during a rare quiet moment, Karen found herself reflecting on how drastically her life had changed. Just weeks ago, she had been snapping selfies in front of iconic landmarks, convinced that the world revolved around her desires. Now she was sharing a cramped cell with strangers, eating bland food, and wearing clothes that smelled faintly of bleach. It was humbling and humiliating, but also strangely clarifying. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't thinking about what she wanted or how others perceived her. Instead, she was forced to confront the person she truly was: impulsive, self-centered, and woefully unaware of the impact her actions could have on others. As the days turned into weeks, Karen resolved to make the most of her time behind bars, not because she had a choice, but because she owed it to herself to grow. She started volunteering for extra chores, offering to help new inmates adjust, and even joining a book club organized by the prison staff. These small acts of kindness didn't erase her mistakes, but they gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. And though she still missed her old life, Karen knew deep down that this experience, painful as it was teaching her lessons she desperately needed to learn. By the time 3 months had passed, Karen wasn't the same woman who had walked through those cold metal doors. She was quieter, more reflective, and far less quick to judge others. When the warden informed her that she was being granted early release due to good behavior, Karen felt a mix of relief and gratitude. Relief because she could finally leave the confines of prison, and gratitude because she now understood that freedom wasn't something to be taken lightly. As she packed her belongings and prepared to step back into the outside world, Karen promised herself one thing: she would never let pride or impulsiveness dictate her choices again. Copy, ask, explain.